IVM.
We saw some high-stakes tension and uncertainty with the Indian Vikram lander recently, as the spacecraft tried to descend safely to the surface of the moon. Executing such a landing on Mars takes all challenges to the next level. People at NASA and JPL call this the 7 minutes of terror. It takes 7 minutes for a spacecraft to enter the atmosphere of Mars and make it to the surface. And it takes roughly 14 minutes for information to travel at the speed of light to get to Earth. So when we first get word about a Mars lander touching the top of the atmosphere, it's already been on the ground, dead or alive, for 7 full minutes. How do you build systems that are robust and capable of making intelligent, autonomous decisions hundreds of millions of miles away from Earth? And Devereaux of the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab is here on the Pragati Podcast today to tell us all about it. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Our guest today is Devereaux, who's currently Manager for Space Systems Engineering at Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech. Previously, she was the lead flight system engineer for the upcoming Mars 2020 rover. She was previously a part of the entry, descent and landing team of the Mars Curiosity rover mission. Anne is an electrical engineer by training and has spent close to 3 decades working at JPL. We recorded this episode outside our studio but in Bangalore. Anne was in India to talk about space and the upcoming Artemis program by NASA. She was here in Bangalore and we were able to record this thanks to the US consulate in Chennai. We'll start our conversation with Anne after a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you are not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I have an announcement for all of you, at least, the couple of dozen of you who are listening to us on SoundCloud. Come the end of October, early November, we're going to be discontinuing that channel. We're not really going to be making our content available on SoundCloud anymore. So if you are listening on SoundCloud, you can have a number of options. I say the best option is downloading the IVM Podcast app, but if not, you can download another podcasting app and you'll be able to find our content over there. We have a couple of new shows launching this week. Let me tell you about those. The first is called Boundless. This is hosted by Natasha Malpani Oswal. She reads her poems on mental health, relationships, family, marriage, and many other topics, and narrates personal anecdotes around these poems. Tune in to new episodes every Monday and Wednesday starting from 7th October. Postcards from Nowhere is hosted by Utsav Momoria. It's a travel podcast where Utsav talks about his journeys to obscure and fascinating places around the world. He explores the culture, history, and people from these places in the form of stories and gives you tips and tricks on solo travel. Tune in to new episodes every Thursday starting from the 10th of October. Here's what else you got on the IVM Podcast Network this week. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by Tej Brar, founder and managing director of Third Culture Entertainment. He tells Cyrus the stories behind his tattoos, talks about the upcoming Neon East Festival, and living in different places around the world from Boston to DC to Delhi. The 150th episode of Simplified is finally here. You sent in your questions and topic suggestions. Now listen to Chuck, Narayan and Shrikit tackle them. On The Habit Coach, Ashton is joined by Shimi Nadraja and Jessica Gabrielli from Power and Posture. They talk about the importance of arm balancing and how handstands can improve posture and build up core strength. On Tech Careers in the New, Shilithya is joined by Jayant Swami and Namrata Maheshwari, Chief Data Architect and Senior Architect at Accenture, to talk in detail about data points. On Golgappa, Trupti is in conversation with actress Sayali Phatak. They talk about her experience in theatre, acting as well as dancing. On Paperback, Racheta and Satyajit talk to Nirbhay Kanoria, the co-founder of online literary magazine The Curious Reader. He lists his favorite non-fiction books and the trends of reading on digital platforms. On Kinetic Living, Coach Urmi shares a surprise workout on Tabata Tuesdays, and on Thriving Thursdays, she shares a story that made her realize just how fragile life is. On Football Shitball, Gaurav, Karthik and Siva round up the Premier League weekend and talk about the absolute demolition Bayern Munich inflicted upon Tottenham. On Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurabh are joined by Pratik Sinha, editor and co-founder of Alt News. They discuss the anatomy of fake news and its prevalence in today's time. And with that, let's get you on with your shows.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It's a pleasure to sit down with you here in Bangalore.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Pavan. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners, tell a little bit about what rocket science is, and see if I can answer any questions you might have.
So you're the, if I'm getting this right, the flight systems engineer, the lead flight systems engineer for the upcoming Mars 2020 mission. And it's really exciting that you're putting a 1-ton rover on the surface of Mars to look at the biological signatures that might exist. That's one of the mission goals of, ancient bacteria or anything else that might have been there on Mars. And also to prepare for future human missions to Mars and doing a lot of very interesting work there. So I wanted to start off by asking, a lot of the times we think about rocket science as being very difficult. What is rocket science? Can you break that down for us? Because I think a lot of the times our imagination gets captured by the big thrusters that are employed and, the liftoff that happens. But rocket science is way more beyond that, right?
Yeah, rocket science is funny. So my background is I have a degree in computer engineering and a degree in communications engineering. But inevitably, like when my mom introduced me to someone, she's like, well, she's a rocket scientist. So clearly there's, I think, a public sort of understanding of rocket science where it's anything to do with space or spaceship or something like that. So actually kind of funny, I think a lot of people might know. So I work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Back when we started in the 40s and 50s, we actually did jet propulsion. But we, little known fact, maybe we haven't done jet propulsion for something like 60 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, so the thing, like you mentioned about rocket science, like, oh, well, it's about, the big rocket, whatever. Well, it turns out that, over the course of the years, more and more private companies build rockets, Israel, different countries, have their own rocket programs. And so, sometime back in the day, JPL kind of made a tack and said, okay, well, giant rockets aren't the place where we want to set our niche. We're going to do instruments and space missions. So somebody else is going to build a rocket for us, and we'll do the stuff on top. And so I think, whenever somebody says rocket scientist, I'm like, I don't really do rockets per se. But I think the general impression of what rocket science is, and I think which is very valid, is all the different disciplines that go into doing a space mission. And this could be an Earth orbiting telescope or an Earth orbiting radar, or also something that goes to the moon or Mars. And so, sometimes people ask me, I'm like, well, I need to get an aeronautical degree and an aerospace degree. And that's completely not true. I mean, we have people who are chemical engineers, who are material science engineers, people like me who are bits and bytes, people who do structural design, people who actually do navigation, like the calculation of, when I leave Earth and then the gravity of Mars starts to pull me in. Yeah, so it really takes all kinds. I like to tell people that I'm not really that fond of math, and it's absolutely true. Like, I like abstract concepts better, but you need both sides. You need the people who can do that really detailed stuff and the people whatever. And so actually my job now is systems engineering, and it's really that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary look at all the different things. I mean, I guess you could call it rocket science. Maybe systems engineering is the rocket science part, where you're taking all the bits and bytes and pieces together, and then you end up with something like a curiosity.
Right. And, we've had quite a few space-related episodes on the Pragati Podcast in the past. We also had the pleasure of having General Charles Bolden on the show.
Oh, yeah.
For a short episode a while ago. So it's great to get a view from you who's building the systems, which is very complementary to the work that astronauts and many others do.
Absolutely.
So could you give us a sense of, when you're thinking about systems that are critical to a spacecraft, especially one that is going to enter the sphere of another planet or the moon or something, what kind of systems become very critical, and how do you go about thinking through the most critical parts of the mission?
Yeah.
I imagine that once things are in space, some of the things are simpler because there's vacuum and you don't have atmosphere and other things sort of making your system very chaotic. But the moment, say, you're going to the edge of the atmosphere of Mars and trying to manage that journey from there to the surface of Mars, I'm guessing that the number of variables, number of things coming in become honestly insane.
Yes. Yeah, so, people think, I think, like, oh, you're going into outer space, and outer space is, hard and whatever. And it turns out, I like to say, there's a reason they call it space, because there's a lot of room. Generally, if you get yourself on a good trajectory, out of the gravity well of the Earth, there's really nothing that's going to perturb you, with thrusters, or if you have, leaks or something. The pressure of solar photons on the spacecraft actually perturbs disturbs you some. But as you can imagine, these are very slow effects. And so actually it's super benign. Also, you can keep yourself pretty much oriented to the sun/Earth, for both communications and for power. And so it's actually like that's the easy part of it. But kind of like you were saying, at the point where now you have gotten, and including the moon, I mean, the moon has a gravity well associated with it, doesn't have the atmosphere, that you have to contend with. But still, as soon as you have now basically a third party, in play, that's when it all kind of gets wacky. And like one of the challenge we had with the Curiosity rover is, there's kind of two ways you can get to another planet. So one is or a moon, you can have the thing that carries you there. And so you are always a lander. You are always the thing that, is supposed to be on the surface. Right. You never have to be interplanetary / moon mission. So like Chandrayaan-2, for example, they did it that way, where they had the orbiter had its own things that it was going to do. By the way, super, super successful. And then the lander was always a lander. It never had to worry about what an orbiter has to think about. It never had to worry about pointing to the sun.
So in that sense, it's modular. It doesn't have to care about things that happen before it in the mission.
Right. And so from a systems engineering point of view, that's a really nice, clean design. Because I don't have to worry about the lander, say, getting confused because it has to orient itself in space, which landers don't usually have to do. When we are working on our Europa lander concept, for example, that would be, toward the end of the next decade, we have a similar sort of concept where there would be a thing that carried you to the planet, to the moon in this case, the moon in Europa, and then there would be the thing that landed, but it was a very clean, functional distinction between them. Okay. Now, Curiosity, which, as you say, is a giant, big boy, 900 kilograms, and then Mars 2020 is even heavier than that. We didn't think it was possible, but she is heavier than that. That was a different beast. She was already big. And so the idea was, which actually was very much like Spirit and Opportunity, the way we did it, and Pathfinder before that, where basically, if you can imagine the Russian nesting dolls. Right. So inside there's the lander and it has a computer and the computer is doing a thing, but then there's the Russian nesting doll of the thing that gets me from the parachute to the ground. There's the thing that gets me through the atmosphere. And then there's the thing that gets me from Earth to Mars. And so actually, I mean, your listeners will probably be appalled. We actually have, compared to modern, we have very slow computers on board. Like 200 megahertz is a screaming fast computer on a spaceship. Because you can imagine, I had the experience when I was coming to India for the first time, and I'm like, I'm kind of nervous. How am I going to find people? I had just upgraded my iPhone 10. Before I left, I hit the button, and software update. I got here, it was a brick. It couldn't do anything. It could barely show the clock. And that was a mistake. I should have never tried to upgrade my phone right before I was going into a different situation. And so it's the same thing with space electronics and software and controls to a large extent. You don't want the first time you do it is on top of, multi-billion-dollar mission just about going to Mars. Right. But anyway, so the computer is quite slow compared to modern computers. And then we only have a few gigabits of memory, and some of that's for data storage. And so we actually, which is a totally scary thought, we actually can't fit the software that both does what we call the cruise part of it. Mm-hmm. Launch is taken care of by other people. Rocket scientists take care of launch. We can't actually fit the cruise software and the landed software at the same time. There's just not enough physical memory. And so what we do is we launch with what we call the cruise load, and it has some basic information on how to be on the surface. Like, you got to turn yourself off at night. You don't have to worry about solar rays. You don't have to do this. So it's got some basic functionality, but it really is basic. And so our big effort, very soon after we reach the surface, and you kind of shake yourself off to say, okay, is it okay, is to now load the software that allows it to run on the surface.
So its main function would be to switch the next thing on.
Yes.
And then sort of hand it over. It's like a relay then, right? Where you hand it off to the next.
It's basically some, if you could imagine like a baby, babies can't even do it. I was going to say, it knows how to keep itself warm. It knows how to communicate. That's like super key. And then it knows how to manage its power, because I don't know, perhaps people realize, So most people know that Curiosity, for example, has a nuclear energy source on it. What they don't realize is that it's not an exciting nuclear reactor. Nope. It's a couple little tiny pellets of nuclear material that basically just decays slowly, gets hot, and then it's not exactly a steam engine because we don't use water, but you use thermocouples basically to change the heat into energy. And so it's like, well, that doesn't sound exciting.
It's a nuclear-powered heater.
It's basically a heater with natural decay. And the power output of the power plant that Curiosity has and the one that 2020 will have is about 100 watts.
Okay.
So it's a light bulb, a very bright light bulb. And so actually one of the big things that the rover has to learn to do for itself that the cruise stage did not, because the cruise stage has these big solar arrays, and so it basically gets infinite power as it's going. With the rover, because it only has this 100 watts of energy, 100 watts will not run the rover. Like it could barely eke out like just its computers running and the pumps that it uses for thermal management. It can't run the radios, for example, at the same time, not on 100 watts straight up. And so what it has is a couple of big batteries inside. And so most of the time, like certainly all night, which I mean, you're not going to drive at night anyway for the same reason. You might not drive at night here. Most of the time it's using that 100 watts to charge up the batteries. And so then with those big batteries, like they're like 80 amp hours for the total of the two batteries. For maybe 6-7 hours during the day, it can drive and it can do experiments and it can do something. But the rover has to be extremely conscientious of what its battery, what we call battery state of charge is, and then be able to shut itself down and more importantly, wake itself back up, based on, how much power is available.
And all that has to be done with so much redundancy and so much, with so little error rates such that it can do this in a foreign environment millions and millions of miles away from us.
Well, there's a classic thing. If you guys Google 7 Minutes of Terror, so there's a great video, my colleague Adam Stelzer, hilarious, like just super, super into all this stuff. But one big point that he makes, which was absolutely valid, is so at the time when Curiosity landed, and it'll be the same when 2020 lands, right? I mean, this is true for Mars missions in general. Depending on where Mars is, the light time, so the time it takes the radio waves to propagate, is non-zero. And in fact, when we landed Curiosity, it was something like 14 minutes.
Right.
So as that whole 7 minutes of terror kind of implied, and I think you had mentioned from the top of the atmosphere when it gets exciting, it throws off the solar rays and it has already thrown off the solar arrays and it's starting to scream down through the atmosphere. That indeed, as they say, takes 7 minutes. So you can see the inherent dichotomy here, right? Adam makes the point in the video, and it's true. By the time we would get notification that the thing had landed or not landed, it had actually happened 7 minutes previous, right? Because there's a 14-minute delay. And so actually we spent a lot of time between Curiosity launch and landing, because we were so busy going up to launch. I mean, I think this is probably true for a lot of places. Like you have to get the hardware right, and it has to be able to survive out there. But if you're running late, which, we were already late. I don't know if people know, we missed the first launch window for Curiosity. She was supposed to launch in 2009. And a year before, some very smart managers were looking around at the hardware coming in late and the software, and they're like, nope, we're gonna pull the plug on this. So she was already 2 years late in launching. So we weren't gonna do that again, right? I mean, you already do something bad, and your father's looking at you funny. So NASA's looking at us funny. You don't want to repeat that same mistake. So we needed to launch the hardware, with some capability. But then for entry, descent, and landing, actually, I moved over to do that full-time right about launch. And we spent those 9 months between launch and landing basically kind of like, I think you implied, basically, are we doing the right thing? Have we covered the right stuff? So like originally, we were going to have Curiosity fly in on all single-sided stuff. So like one computer, one set of control electronics, one pump going, like everything was one radio, everything was going to be single. And literally, a few months in, we're like, that doesn't feel right. But then, there's always a trade. Like, when you have a very, very fancy car with a lot of electronics in it, what goes wrong? the electronics. Right? Yeah, I mean, it's supposed to make it better.
The car will still perhaps work.
Exactly. And so we would have these debates, like we'd have 10 people in the room and we'd be there till 8, 9 o'clock at night just debating, well, if this went out and then this happened, just running these scenarios through your head, because actually that, I mean, good for me because I'm not a math person, but a lot of this stuff is so, I was going to say philosophical, but it's almost like a logic puzzle. If this, then this, and it's really hard to write out in a deterministic way. What if that heater was still out? And what if it tried to swap heaters, but it turns out it had this problem and something. And so because of the fact that we have this long time delay and it only takes 7 minutes from the atmosphere, which is really the point of no return, though honestly, weeks before then, we don't have a lot of chance to do a lot of things. So actually, about a week before it was supposed to land, we sent up a command, which was, and I kid you not, it was do_EDL. Okay. Legit. So a week before we landed, we sent this command, and you'll love this because people think, oh, it's autonomous and it's, fancy, whatever. No. So the whole landing sequence, which for the week right before landing is really just, make sure that you have heaters going to heat the thrusters you're going to have to use and make sure the radios are in the right configuration. So it's not much going on. It's basically cruising on its way, right, into the entry point in the atmosphere. But the way that we do it is for everything that it has to do, release this ballast mass, control these thrusters, it's a giant Excel spreadsheet. Okay. And it has all the actions that it's supposed to do. And the actions have code behind them. Like, when you say, warm up the thruster heaters, for example, like there's some software that knows how to do that. Right. But the actual, this is the action you have to do. Like there's a line in the Excel spreadsheet that has that. And it says how long it should take. It says how long you're allowed to take. Because one other thing with, an entry, descent, and landing, when, say, I'm driving my car and a red light comes on, I might be like, I should get that checked. If you're landing and you have one shot, it's like, you know what? I'm going to just hope that works. And I'm not going to, so there was this definite philosophy of just go for it. No matter what kind of things you see going wrong that would normally make the spacecraft stop and think about it, no, you just keep going. So the spreadsheet very much has this. Like, it'll try to do the stuff, but if any of those actions had failed, it would just move down to the next action. Okay. So we have this giant Excel spreadsheet, and you're thinking, wow, that doesn't seem very high tech. But anyway, we would feed that into a software kind of engine, and it would create the actual software commands out of it. But that's how that thing landed. And we actually had some debates. I talked about it having to basically go ballistic on itself, like not ballistic in that real sense, but basically just, as we say in English, damn the torpedoes, just do whatever it has to do. One of the things that we do is we actually turn off fault protection. So the things that it would normally do to protect itself, like I mentioned, like it go into safe mode or swap things, we're like, nope, you're not allowed to do any of that. And so we had some big debates, like right before landing, about, well, what if we disabled fault protection earlier or later, and how that would really work, like how we could actually, if people had a chance to intervene, like what would we do? Like we're already, when we see a problem, the problem happened 14 minutes ago. Okay. Now people who are already nervous are going to try to come to a good decision, which of course will not work. Okay. And then it's going to take 14 minutes for it to get there. And so we really had to convince ourselves.
All the if then else's need to be mapped out.
Have to be, yeah. And
so what you said starts off as a new philosophical or abstract discussion, becomes something that you have to make a deterministic decision model out of, a decision tree.
And you have to, and the thing is you have to convince other humans that you're doing the right thing, because, at some point we would always not joke, well, what are we going to tell the congressional, like the U.S., what are we going to tell the congressional hearing, that we could have done something?
Right. Because there's a lot of public money riding on this.
A lot of public money.
There has to be accountability. And
that's actually a very, very good way of putting it. So actually, you talk about the challenges and everything. The thing I like about the stuff we do is not the stuff where you can just write the equations out and get the answer. I kind of like that uncertainty where you have to make a judgment call and say, well, you know what? There's no right or wrong answer. This is the best answer that we have. And some people are very uncomfortable with that. Like even engineers are very uncomfortable, unless they can prove it to themselves, mathematically or whatever, they don't want to make a call. And we had some people like that who'd be like, well, there's here's the two things. And I'd be like, okay, well, which one are we going to choose? And they're like, well, you can't choose. And I'm like, well, we have to choose. Like you said, you have to have that decision tree. And they were stymied because there was no right answer. And so therefore, I don't know, there was no answer at all.
And here, what amazed me is you actually preempted my question of what happens, what work would you be doing, say for the Mars 2020 mission after launch and before it gets to Mars. And it's amazing that while the software and the hardware are obviously already preset, a lot of these decisions get finalized later. The decision trees get finalized even in that period, because I'm guessing you'd be busy doing a lot of other things before the launch.
Yeah.
So that is simply amazing. Could you tell us a little more about these constraints? So you were talking about 200 megahertz only as the computing power. Is it because you need these to be electronics that are sort of space grade that can tolerate a lot of radiation, a lot of other stresses from temperature to other things? Because now we are seeing commercial electronics reach the low Earth orbit, right, with CubeSats and with a lot of other things. But when we're talking about deep space and interplanetary missions, the electronics are fundamentally different from the consumer electronics that we're used to, right?
Yeah. So you're exactly right. There's kind of two elements that we look for, and parts are huge. Like anytime anybody is building anything, it's all about the electronic parts and the reliability that you can think that you're going to get from them. So there's kind of two sides. So one are parts that are generally robust. And that can tend to be older technologies, right? I mean, you imagine the car that doesn't have a lot of electronics in it versus the cars that have, tons and tons of electronics in it. So that's kind of true too. I mean, that's one side of it. But then the other side are parts that also you just have some history with. Like me with my iPhone 10 doing the upgrade. That was a mistake to do it the first time on my basically one-shot. This is my first trip to India. That was a mistake to try something new when I was going into an environment that was completely different to me. So the thing with commercial electronics a lot is, so two things. One is what we say the process is not as controlled, because if you're making 1 billion chips, now this is getting to be less and less true, right? Because there's real money riding on this. And when you're putting 1 million chips through, you don't want to have chips falling off the process because, they've been damaged or they weren't put together right or that sort of thing. So the process control is getting better and better. What process control gives you is if I pick this part off the line and I test the snot out of it to make sure that it can work, if I take the second part off the line, I have some understanding that it's going to be the same, that it's going to be equally reliable. With commercial processes, that has not been as true, but could be getting more true. I mean, the thing is, we talk about, you have FPGAs, so you have programmable gate arrays, kind of like little teeny brains that work, like in a car, say again, some might do the radio, some might do the ignition system, some might do the automatic traction control, whatever it is. If one of those goes bad, you pull off to the side of the road and, your car gets fixed. But because we're sending these things into space and they, even just to get where they're going, might take 8 months or whatever, so they have to survive that. But, we're not 100% sure. We think we've built in the temperature range. We buy parts that are guaranteed from minus 55 to plus 125 C. That's pretty extreme for a lot of parts. Yeah. Parts that can stand up under radiation, you kind of mentioned that, both from kind of an aging point of view, that's just getting this, what we call the total dose, but also where energetic particles come in and flip a bit or, cause a problem. Right. We just don't have the luxury of pulling it back and replacing those parts. So like you said, so number one, it's about parts reliability, but then number two, it's about redundancy, at least for things that we really care about, that we have to have. So a lot of times the science instrumentation will have little to no redundancy, maybe redundant power supplies, because power supplies are a thing that can go bad. But generally you wouldn't have two of the same instrument, for example. There's just not the room and, the money, of course. But for flight computers, almost inevitably you're going to have two flight computers because you can't afford if one goes bad. Curiosity's had problems with its memory on the flight computers, and we've always been able to recover, but it does seem to be true that some of the parts might have gone bad. but like I said, it's working, but you want to have that other computer to fall back on while you figure out how to work the first one.
So one other number, if I can ask, when you're communicating with a rover or a lander or even an orbiter, what kind of bit rates do you get? I mean, when we're talking about deep space communication, how much information can you send?
Because
you also need to receive a lot of imagery and so on, and that's quite heavy, right?
Yeah. Well, it's so the radios, the communication link that you generally that you can get is basically all about the distance, right? So if you're at Mars, you're at a certain distance.
Right.
With a rover, especially, like if I was doing a Mars habitat, sure, I could put a giant antenna dish on there and a giant transmitter, and we'd be all good. But of course, with a rover rolling around, you can't do that. And so what we do, certainly at Mars, and presumably we will be doing at the Moon, not exactly for distance, but because sometimes you're out of sight of the Earth, is we cheat, and we put relay radios in orbit. Yeah. So rather than me with my little teeny, it's the size of a car, but still, compared to the distance to Earth with my little rover, rather than it having to go direct to Earth, which we still do, what it does, so usually with the rover, the commanding comes direct to Earth because they do the commands overnight and they're ready to go. And then the command file is usually pretty small. It's basically do this, do that, do the other thing. And, kind of like if I left you a to-do list on the refrigerator, like, honey, I need you to go to the supermarket, whatever. I don't need to tell you what it takes to go to the supermarket. Like, you already have that built in.
Right.
And so the rover has that too. And so we would send a command file up from the ground every day to tell the rover what to do. But as you point out, the data coming back, you have images, you have spectrogram, you have all this stuff. And so that data generally comes back through one of these relay orbiters. So we have several orbiters, including Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, MAVEN, the Trace Gas Orbiter, which is actually a European orbiter, that all have relay radios on board. And so Curiosity 2020 will have both, and InSight, I think, has both as well. We'll have a radio that can talk directly to Earth, but then we'll also have a radio that specifically, it's a different frequency band, it's a different protocol. We'll have one that can talk to the orbiter. So generally, it goes up direct from Earth, very low rate, maybe on the order of kilobits. So you probably don't remember dial-up modem, but anybody,
I do.
That has like the terrible tones and whatever.
Yes,
it's
I grew up on that.
It's like dial-up internet. So generally that'll be going forward, but then coming back, we can get on the order of 256, 512K, which for spacecraft is enormous. But again,
512 is technically broadband in India.
Okay, all right.
So we have broadband reception, so download speeds from Mars are broadband by Indian standards, and upload speeds are slow.
Yes. But I mean, obviously we'd love to have huge pipes going both ways, but all things being equal, unless we're doing a software load, in which case we're really sitting around and that's all we're doing for a few days, there's just not that much need to send a lot of data up.
Right.
But obviously there's a need to send, a lot of data down. And so letting those two links operate essentially independently, not tying one to the other, makes a lot of sense.
So in this entire process, you've been now a part of multiple Mars missions, and there's a new one coming up. Any particular points that you get a lot of joy out of, that you think is a particularly complex puzzle to solve, or something that's very rewarding in this process?
Actually, I talked about, I actually like the uncertainty. I like making decisions that aren't, obvious decisions and whatever. I think, so I actually came to JPL right out of undergrad, and I've worked at JPL my whole life. People probably realize that big NASA, there's like a dozen NASA centers. I could add them up. They're different places. And so ISRO, it's very akin to ISRO, where ISRO has a lot of locations. And for example, like when I grew up by Kennedy Space Center, where we do the launches, which I'm going to try this word, Sriharikota?
Yes.
Where ISRO does launches. So very similar in missions in those two places. And, I don't know about Sriharikota, but certainly Kennedy, they really focus on the rocket launches. Like that is their raison d'etre. JPL is much more like the Space Application Center in Ahmedabad, where yes, it's about the missions, it's about, kind of concepts, like what kind of science questions are we trying to ask and what would it take to do that. And I would say that, as I've gone in my career, I'm actually not the lead system engineer for 2020 anymore. I took a year or two ago, I took a job as a manager of systems engineering.
Okay.
And so now the people who do that system engineering for 2020 work for me, but also the people that are doing it for Europa Clipper, the people who are doing it for NISAR, the NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar mission, which we're really, really excited about. So I get... Now, at this point in my career, I really get to see the big picture of all the missions, and JPL is in, sort of a good, bad position where we generally propose to NASA, like, these are the things that we want to do. And then, NASA, depending on the funding and the interest from scientists, will say yes or no. But I like that sort of strategic, like, where would we go next? Like, what questions are we going to ask about Europa? What does Mars sample return look like? Like, how does 2020 fit into the overall 3-mission series that would get us Mars sample return? So it's nice after, years of building stuff and then kind of more years of, like, I'm focusing on my spacecraft and what do I need to do to get my spacecraft done. It's nice to be, part of the group now that sits back and says, well, no, what do we, JPL, want to do? Like, what do we want to do? What does the space program, what should we be doing? And by the way, Earth science is a big focus for JPL too. So I would say it's still that kind of, not easy answers, kind of nonlinear thinking, but now at a bigger than one spacecraft sort of perspective, kind of more like, what does space exploration look like?
And in this, like you mentioned earlier, JPL is an institution that has actually not focused on jet propulsion for quite a while now. With NASA having its own future, how does JPL sort of look at itself as an institution? Because like NASA now, JPL has a global presence and an image. Everyone knows about Jet Propulsion Labs. What's sort of the vision and sort of the idea of JPL and what it wants to be now in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you, it's one that we struggle with ourselves.
I think if we are not struggling with those questions, then probably we have the wrong answers.
Thank you. That's actually brilliant. Yeah. So the idea is, JPL, even though we are not civil servants, like I don't work directly for the government, we work for the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and Caltech runs JPL on behalf of NASA. So we are NASA, but we're not civil servants per se.
So in that sense, is it similar to, say, the Los Alamos Laboratory and other things?
It's exactly.
But on space and not on defense.
Exactly. It's what's called a federally funded research and development center. So, I mean, people write that down because that'll be important. Anyway, so we're definitely nonprofit. We're not making money off of this. And so then the idea is, kind of, I suppose any nonprofit, philanthropic, maybe place, it's like, well, besides just perpetuating ourselves, that there is a JPL in the future, what do we want to get into? Where should we be positioning? We've been very, very lucky that in the U.S. space program, we've really been one of the key centers for robotic space exploration. And we see ourselves probably always continuing that. So we're very intrigued by the whole Artemis program and the mission to the moon. And we're thinking about, well, how can we contribute to that? It would probably be in like robotic exploration, robotic prospecting. I like to say, a little bit jokingly, we don't like to get into the human business because humans are messy and they need to eat and drink and whatever, and that's kind of not our deal. But we have other NASA centers that focus specifically on that. So we see JPL being kind of a pathfinder place and a technology and robotic exploration place. And hopefully that'll be a good complement to the overall drive of NASA, and then NASA pulling in international partners and industrial partners to do this next step, permanent presence on the moon and then eventually Mars.
Thank you so much. And I think that no matter where humans might end up going, we will need robots to get there first and sort of pave the way for us, find the path for us, right? And I'm also really looking forward to how robotic missions can sort of sit alongside human missions and sort of work together. We've seen enough examples from science fiction.
It can go bad.
All the way
it can go
there.
good or bad. Yes. Absolutely. That's a really good way of looking at it.
And I'm really looking forward to seeing what's to come in the coming 2-3 years with Mars 2020 and beyond. Thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Thank you, Pavan. This has been really, really fun. I hope your listeners got something out of this.
Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Hello everyone, I'm Zain.
I'm Avanti.
And welcome back to a brand new season of Marbles Lost and Found.
A show on mental health and its stigma, and we're kind of making it an open conversation.
Pretty much, yeah. And we're really, really excited about this season because we have a number of guests on and we'll be talking about things like addiction,
grief, children and mental health.
Exactly, children and mental health. And our listeners have also written in
this
time. Yes,
and we have an episode dedicated to that.
Yes, and guys, thank you so much for writing, and we really, really appreciate it.
And we're really excited for you to tune in on Tuesdays on the IVM website or app or wherever you get your podcasts from.
And you can find Marbles Lost and Found on Facebook, or you can find Marbles Lost and Found on Instagram as well, the handle being Marbles Podcast India.
Can't wait for you to tune in.
Thank you very much. See you guys soon.